This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Before we dive into today's show, I want to let you know about an opportunity to see Vermont Edition in action, not just hear it. As part of our ongoing series, Town by Town, we are headed to Windham County next Wednesday, November 12th. We'll be doing our show from the Nature Museum in Grafton. We're going to talk with longtime residents and the editor of the Grafton News to learn about what it's like to live there. Now, if you live in the area, we would love to have you there with us. There is limited seating available, so you can reserve your seat now at vermontpublic.org/events. Again, this is a week from today, Wednesday, November 12th. And at the end of that show, we're going to be spinning our big spinny wheel to select our next stop on Town by Town. Today's conversation has its roots in the Northeast Kingdom town of Glover. During the Civil War, a young man named Dan Mason enlisted in the Union Army. He and his fiancée, Harriet Clark, also of Glover, wrote each other more than 100 letters during the conflict. These letters tell the story of their love, but also the perspective of Vermont on slavery and this war to defeat the Confederacy. Dan and Harriet are at the heart of a new nonfiction book by Tyler Alexander. He taught history and politics for 17 years at North Country Union High School in Newport. Now he teaches at Champlain Valley Union High School in Heinsberg, and he's a resident of Richmond. His book just came out this fall. It's called If I Can Get Home This Fall, a story of love, loss, and a cause in the Civil War. Tyler, welcome to Vermont Edition.
Thank you, Michaela.
Very glad to have you here. And listeners, if you have questions about Vermont's role in the Civil War or an interesting factoid or story to share about it, give us a call. We know there are some Civil War buffs out there listening right now. Our number is 800-639-2211. You can also send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Tyler, before we get to the book, I would love to hear a little bit about your own familial connections to the Civil War. Your middle name, as I've learned, is Elijah, the name of one of your ancestors. Who was he?
He was a private in Company D of the 6th Vermont Infantry from the town of Glover, and he was my third great-grandfather. There were about 35,000 Vermonters who served in the Civil War, so he was one of tens of thousands. And we have 5 letters that he wrote to his brother that are in the collection of the Glover Historical Society, and they tell us quite a bit about what he experienced in Grant's overland campaign toward Richmond. So I've always been fascinated by learning more about the rank and file of the Civil War. He was an enlisted person, not an officer, and Dan Mason was a sergeant in that same company from the same town, and they served alongside one another. So that's really how I became interested in Mason's story in the first place.
So Dan Mason, the primary subject of your book, he was a soldier, as you just said, in the 6th Vermont Infantry. Tell us a little bit about him before his time in the Civil War. Who was he? How old was he when he enlisted? Things like that.
Mason was born in 1840, so he was 21 when he enlisted. And he was a farmer from the hills of Glover, of modest means. They grew potatoes and they raised sheep, and they had a few milk cows and beef cows and a couple of horses, very typical for a farm in northern Vermont at that time. They
just your average guy.
Made maple sugar, and he had an education through 8th grade. That was common at the time. Vermont funded public schools through 8th grade, and then he attended the Orleans Liberal Institute, which was a private academy in Glover within walking distance of his house. So he had the equivalent of a high school education, and then for a brief time was a teacher in the public schools before the war began.
And how did you discover this trove of letters that he wrote?
Well, I explained that in the preface of my book, but I was walking through Westlook Cemetery in Glover on Father's Day in 2007 with my father, and it's sacred ground for me and my family.
I was going to say, that's not a typical Father's Day activity. Usually people have brunch.
Oh, for our family, this is sacred soil.
Okay.
It's hallowed ground. And I have generations of ancestors buried there going back to the early 1800s.
Wow.
And so we visited my grandfather's grave, and we also fished the Barton River that day. It was a gorgeous day. And while we were there, he said, I want to show you this grave. My father had a long interest in the Civil War. And he had seen this gravestone before, and it was Mason's headstone. It's a beautiful stone, and it lists all the engagements he fought in during the war. And my father had found that to be quite impressive, and he said something to the effect of, I can't imagine being at all these places, Antietam, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, Petersburg, Fredericksburg. What would that have been like? And so I knew that Dan Mason was a soldier from Glover, and I could see where he died and how, but it wasn't until years later that I learned that his letters were in the collection of the Vermont Historical Society. So that's when I really became interested in reading them and learning more about the town of Glover, Vermont, and the experience of enlisted troops, especially from the Northeast Kingdom in the war.
Well, there are some really moving letters included in your book that really paint a picture of the actual person who was in this war. I think when we talk about the Civil War, a lot of times it's about, which, the troops that were going to this place on this day and how long it took them and how many casualties there were. But you are really focused on a real person with a life and a heart, somebody who is very in love. He and Harriet really loved each other. You could tell from these letters.
Yes, and like all love stories, this one is full of strife and arguments that take weeks to resolve or months, that require several exchanges of letters back and forth to finally come to terms. It's just so timeless. And there's full of gossip about locals back home, and they're commenting on other relationships. And Mason comments at one point about a younger woman who's with an older Glover man, and how could she fall for him? He's an old, dried-up, hunchback, red-nosed, toothless bachelor. It's got to be his money that attracted her, and there's no other explanation for it. So you run into tidbits like that constantly, and you can't help but laugh.
Oh my gosh, I'm glad our ancestors gossip just as much as we do today. Well, we actually have a segment of one of Dan Mason's letters that we're going to play now. It was read aloud by Vermont Edition's own managing editor, John Ahrens.
Dear Harriet, I take this opportunity to answer your worthy letter bearing the date February 12th. As usual, it was a welcome visitor. I experienced much pleasure in perusing its contents. I consider you about perfect, or as near to it as anyone. I know you to be the possessor of true patriotism. This you have proved by your actions. I honor and admire you more, yes, love you more if possible, than I did previous to your being brought to the test. I'm afraid that you are staying at home this winter from parties and social gatherings on my account. If so, you are not doing right. I want you should go every chance that you can get, with likely fellows, and I know you to be pure to accompany any that were not. I am not afraid to trust you. I have perfect confidence in you. I believe your love to be as pure and lasting as ever kindled in woman's heart. I long for the time to arrive when peace shall be declared throughout the land, and the Grand Army of the Potomac and all Union forces shall be disbanded and returned to their respective homes. I long to grasp your loving hand and steal a kiss from your loving lips.
It's a very beautiful message, full of hope and trust in a woman who is waiting for him in his hometown. But as you said, Tyler, not all of their letters were this loving and trustful, right? They went through some strife.
For sure. She scolds him many times, and he says he admires her lectures, and he can't wait to come home and be the recipient of her lectures in person.
Rude.
She's very concerned about his virtue and morality and what he's doing when he's 500 miles away in Virginia. And they're separated for years before he returns. He came home for the first time during the war in December of 1863, So it enlisted in September of 1861, so it was over 2 years before he saw her. And he has to assure her that I don't drink and I don't gamble and I don't take the name of God in vain. And I have had no improper intercourse with women since I've donned the blue uniform, but I can't say the same for my comrades. So he has to reassure her many times about his virtue.
And we have lots of letters from soldiers who fought on both sides of the Civil War. Was there something particular about Dan Mason's letters that stood out to you or distinguishes them from other conserved letters from that era?
Well, there's no end to reading Civil War letters. You can spend the rest of your life digging through archives trying to uncover letters that nobody's read for 160 years.
Right.
And there are, I think, some commonalities between his letters and others I've seen in terms of the language that's used, the very romanticized language that's characteristic of the Victorian period in the mid-19th century, and also the language of the Second Great Awakening. A lot of his references are infused with that religious symbolism and understanding of what a democratic nation should look like. But I also think this is unique in that he is such an elegant writer, and he became an officer in a black regiment too. So that's something that not every Civil War soldier could lay claim to, and that I think adds some extra significance to this. As a Vermont soldier leading formerly enslaved men into battle, that's really significant.
Yeah, he was an officer in the 19th U.S. Colored Troops, as it was called. And I want to talk to you more about that, Tyler, but we do have to take a short break. So save that for just a minute. And we'd also love to hear from you, our listeners. If you have a family member who you can trace back to the Civil War, maybe they fought for the Union or the Confederacy, you can give us a call. Tell us about your research. To 800-639-2211. You can also email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. We'll hear more about Dan Mason's journey in just a moment. Stay with us.
Thanks for listening to Vermont Edition, where support comes from UVM Cancer Center, sharing that November is Lung Cancer Awareness Month. Learn how lung screening can save lives at vermontcancer.org.
Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. This hour, we are learning about the love story of two Vermonters during the Civil War. Their letters form the backbone of a new book, a nonfiction book, by Richmond author Tyler Alexander. He is also a history and politics teacher at Champlain Valley Union High School. His book is called If I Can Get Home This Fall, a story of love, loss, and a cause in the Civil War. The letter writer and soldier at the heart of this story is named Dan Mason. He was from Glover. And as you were just about to tell us, Tyler, he eventually became an officer. What was the unit that he was in charge of?
Sure. Well, he originally enlisted in the 6th Vermont for a period of 3 years. And in the winter of 1863 to 1864, the major question in the original units was whether or not soldiers would reenlist when that term of service expired. And the war was still with still 2 years to go. There was no end in sight. And so that was a deeply personal question that many soldiers were tormented by and had to wrestle with. And when he came home for the first time out of 3 times during the war on a furlough, he wrote to Harriet after he left, and he said he had a terribly hard time leaving her. And his letter reveals what that last night looked like. He was up late with her, romancing, and went back to bed at 2 in the morning and only slept for a couple of hours before his father had to carry him out to Barton to catch the train so he could go back to Virginia. And he said that he he was cured of the reenlist fever after having been home and seen her. And he said his sister bade him a tearful goodbye. And he acknowledged in his letter that Harriet had admitted that she had broke down after he left. And we don't have her letters because he burned them all. So I have to try to glean what she was thinking and feeling through his letters, but you can get some glimpses of that, including this. And he said, I am homesick, lovesick, or something else. I never have felt so discontented since I have been in the service as now. You don't know how I long to see you. I don't know, but it has cured me of the re-enlist fever. I can't bear the thought now. But then as soon as he gets back to Virginia, he does just that. He re-enlists, as so many other veterans did. And this time he became an officer in a black regiment. And that was something that you'd have to seek out. And there are lots of motives for white officers looking to fill those positions, but a lot of it was economic. You'd get paid a lot more than you would as a enlisted person. But he also writes that he felt very strongly in arming black troops and in making soldiers of them, which is not an insignificant remark, because even people in a very strongly abolitionist state who really believed in emancipation were often lukewarm when it came to actually arming black troops and giving them guns and marching into the South against the, as the term was at that time, slaveocracy or slave oligarchy. And Mason strongly supported that, and the War Department was looking for officers who believed in that. They did not want to give commissions to white officers who were skeptical of giving black soldiers guns.
If you have questions about Vermont's role in the Civil War or Vermonters' views on slavery at that time, you can call in at 800-639-2211. Tyler, of course, it is possible to be an abolitionist, to be against slavery, but to simultaneously hold racist views. Did Dan Mason?
I'd say so, yes. There are times where he referred to himself when conducting a battalion drill as a coon dog, and uses other language like that at times, which is very troubling and racist no matter how you look at it. But then this is why you have to read all of the letters, not just a few of them. In most of the letters, he speaks very affectionately about the troops that he's commanding, and with great pride, and really commends them for their discipline and their soldierly qualities and their manhood. He uses that term a lot, manhood, that these are men, which is also not insignificant. That's something that abolitionists and later generations of Americans who fought for civil rights insisted on. I am a man, and Mason clearly believed that they were, and showed no second thoughts about actually having them in combat roles, not just as support troops, but in combat. And that most notably happens at the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864, which is a terrible defeat for the Union and a horrific racial slaughter. But even after that, when many northern newspapers are blaming the black troops for the failure of that assault, he really, really defends them. And he's very upset by those who are quick to jump to conclusions that this is proof that the colored troops can't fight. He is very insistent that that's just not the case.
We often look back at the Civil War and think of it in very stark terms. There were two sides, two clear-cut sides. The North was against slavery. The South was for slavery. Have you learned in your process of researching this book about any regional differences within the state of Vermont at that time about slavery?
It's easy to look at things through that lens. That's sort of the elementary school version that we're taught, or at least I was taught. But like any other political conflict, there's a whole range of opinions. I think that the American Revolution, certainly we see that dynamic. It's a civil war as much as it is a war against the British Empire. And in the Civil War, too, the North is hardly united on these major questions about whether the draft is constitutional, whether emancipation is constitutional, whether arming black troops is a wise policy. And when Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation, it's only in certain areas, not in others. But generally speaking, historians have argued that there is a difference, regional differences within the North, that attitude followed latitude in many cases. The further away from the Mason-Dixon line you get, generally speaking, that the more abolitionist those areas are. But even so, if you look at electoral data, Vermont is still quite different than even New Hampshire or New York or even Massachusetts, with Boston, the hotbed of abolitionism. Vermont was the most anti-slavery state in the Union, voted for Abraham Lincoln by 75% of its popular vote in 1860 and again in 1864, more than any other state in 1860. So within Vermont, there are pockets of resistance to the Lincoln administration. There's newspapers in Montpelier and Burlington elsewhere that are critical of him and think that the war is a failure and Lincoln's policies have gotten us nowhere except just a great loss of life, and are calling for a restoration of the Union as it was and the Constitution as it was, with essentially slavery intact. But they're the minority in Vermont. Those voices are out there, but I'm convinced that they're in the minority and that Mason is representative of public opinion as a whole. I'll read one letter that he wrote after the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This is just 2 days later, November 21st, 1863. And he says this: "When one feels he is battling for the right, when he thinks of the principles he is supporting, when he thinks that he is knocking out the rotten, treacherous walls of slavery on which our government has tattered and reeled, threatening to engulf us from the commencement and substituting in place of the granite walls of freedom, when he thinks that his government is passing through the fiery ordeal, when he thinks that the eyes of all civilized nations are looking on, speculating whether a republican government can sustain itself or not, then it is that the soldier's heart swells with emotions of pride and patriotism, and trusting in the God of battles, he nerves himself to the conflict. Under such feelings, the roar of cannon and the rattle of musketry and the din of war become grand and sublime." So, to me, that's real patriotism. Yeah. Being willing to stick your neck out for somebody else for years and not knowing what's going to happen from day to day. And you get a sense of his style in just that one excerpt of one letter. I think it's a testament to Vermont's public schools, too, at the time.
I was just going to say, Tyler, you're a high school history and politics teacher. I imagine that reading these letters for the first time was like catnip for you, and such a perfect entry point for you and hopefully for your students into a war that can feel very, kind of set in stone and far away for many young people today. Do you talk about Dan Mason in your classes?
I do. And I think that human stories connect us to the past, and ultimately this is a human story. And as you mentioned earlier, there are other ways of engaging with the past or reading about it. There are plenty of anthologies of letters that I've read, or biographies of famous individuals, campaign studies, thematic analyses of the war. But this is more intimate. It's a collection of real letters that were written by a soldier from the town of Glover, just an ordinary individual who grew up on a farm and wrote this well. And so it's just irresistible. So many of my students, for instance, are fans of the Hamilton musical, and they're so familiar with the founding and of Hamilton in particular and the Schuyler sisters because that musical humanized him and brought him to life in a way that reading the Federalist Papers just wouldn't do nearly as well. So I'm hoping that by telling this very human story, that readers or my students can feel a connection to the past and feel proud to continue the legacy that Vermonters then fought for and struggled for, and be inspired to take action themselves today. We were just looking at the 19th Amendment in my class, and it's one thing to just say, well, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, moving on. But if you think about Alice Paul's hunger strike and being force-fed and really have a better feel for the human dimension of that.
And this was the amendment that gave women the right to vote.
Not gave women the right to vote, but where women earned the right to vote.
Oh, we have a history teacher here. Good wording. I appreciate it.
But you have to feel the past to really appreciate what true heroism looks like and what patriotism looks like. And I ask my students, what would you be willing to sacrifice for? Who are you going to be willing to stick your neck out for? And for how long? And those questions really get them thinking. And I think about those questions, too, all the time. I think we all should.
Yeah. What was the ultimate fate of Dan Mason?
Well, I'm hesitant to...
I'm asking you to tell the end of your book.
Too many spoilers here, but I can give you some context. He survives the war. He is at some very harrowing, violent battles. And those descriptions are very moving and powerful and riveting, especially his description of the Battle of the Crater, where he is nearly killed and he witnesses many of his troops that he's leading get blown up, and he writes about it in graphic detail by the explosion of mortar shells, and then many of those soldiers are not given medical assistance. They're captured but not treated as prisoners of war because they're black, and the Confederacy isn't going to recognize them as legitimate combatants. So anyway, he makes it through all of these harrowing moments, and he comes home toward the end of the war on his third furlough, and he gets married finally, knowing that he'll have to go back. He tenders his resignation in January of 1865, but it gets disapproved at the very top. It gets approved at the regimental and brigade, division, corps levels, but it gets rejected from the Army level. So he has to stay on active duty, but he at least is able to come home and get married in March of 1865. And is only home for a couple of weeks, but it is clear that in that time, Harriet becomes pregnant. So he and Harriet are very efficient. And he receives news of that about 3 months after the fact, and he is shocked and startled, and he says the news is worse than the bursting of bombshells in the middle of the night. And how am I going to...
That's what gets to him after the whole Civil War?
He's got quite a sense of humor, and he deliberately provokes Harriet, too. He's looking for a response, and he gets it.
Okay, he's needling her.
And she responds, and he says that he'll expect Hail Columbia in her next letter. That was the term that he used. He says, how are we going to sleep? How are we going to, with a music box? But he gets sent down to Texas after the war with his unit, and a lot of it is because of racial politics. There's lots of evidence I found that suggested that the Union High Command did not want black occupation troops outside of Richmond, Virginia after the war. That they're a political liability now that we're trying to reconstruct the former Confederate states and appease the Southern civilians. There's allegations of rape made by Southern white women against black troops, and Henry Halleck and Grant and other Union generals basically say, I want them out of here, and they get sent to the Rio Grande in Texas to keep an eye on the French in Mexico who are there and worried about Confederates escaping across the Mexican border. So it's the last place he wants to be. And there's a disease outbreak that happens there, and Mason's colonel in his regiment is begging for a regimental hospital to be established to have better medical care for his troops. And it gets rejected. That idea is rejected by at the brigade and division corps levels because, well, we have a corps hospital or a division hospital. That's enough. We don't need regimental hospitals. It's not necessary. And of course, black troops are given the worst medical treatment. They're sent to the worst places and in the least desirable circumstances. So Mason, as a white officer, is with that unit. He desperately wants to come home. He writes to Harriet, "If only I can get home this fall, how happy we shall be." And now she's pregnant, so he has even more of an incentive to get home. But you'll have to read the rest to find out what happens.
All right, we'll leave it with that cliffhanger. I usually, Tyler, when talking with an author, don't bring up a book's cover. Feels a bit gauche, but this cover has a really great story attached to it. It features a painting by the Vermont Civil War veteran, Julian Scott, and this painting used to reside outside of Vermont, in Texas, actually, I believe. But now it's back in the state house, in part thanks to you. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, sure. This is a painting that I'd first seen in a Time Life military atlas of the Civil War probably 30 years ago. And it caught my attention right away. I recognized it as Julian Scott's work even before I read the caption, just because his style is so distinctive. And so I knew that the painting existed somewhere. And when I read an account of that battle in Mason's letters, which was very gripping and graphic, I wanted to find that painting so I could feature it in the book in some way, but I had no idea where it was or who owned it. And of course, I have to get permission to use it. Mm-hmm. I can't just use an image off of Google. So I had no leads. There was nothing on the internet. There were the image credits in that atlas listed Sotheby's auction house in New York City. In 1983, they auctioned it off, but I contacted them and they wouldn't give me any information. So a lot of dead ends, but eventually I got a lead from Vermont Civil War Julian Scott scholar named Bob Titterton, and he pointed me in the right direction based on some information he'd received 12 years ago. And so, long story short, I eventually discovered that the painting is at the University of Houston in Texas. It's owned by the history department. And my timing was very fortuitous because when I finally tracked it down, they said, well, we're thinking about auctioning it off to raise money for a scholarship fund. And I said, well, I think it belongs in Vermont. And so I contacted the state curator's office, David Sheets, and he was instrumental in making arrangements with various people in the state. And Mr. Lyman Orton of the Vermont Country Store ended up buying it at auction this past spring.
Noted art collector.
Noted art collector for the love of Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
This is a little outside of his usual repertoire of landscape paintings and covered bridges and so on. But he recognized the value of this and the significance, and it was just unveiled at the State House a week ago.
Mm. And now people can go visit it whenever they want.
It's on exhibition there, and it was a very generous act on his part to bring this painting home. And I think it is really a haunting scene. It depicts the Battle of Banks Ford on May 4th, 1863, which was part of the Chancellorsville campaign. And that was a terrible defeat for the Union. It devastated Abraham Lincoln. Afterwards, he said, my God, what will the country say? He could not find a general that could give him a victory. And the moment, it was a dark moment for the Union, for democracy, for the idea that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. There was no guarantee that it wouldn't at that point. The Confederacy could have won. The northern people could have lost the will to continue the war, but they didn't, as Mason's letters and so many others make clear. And that particular scene, I think, captures that resolve and that conviction of advancing under fire against an unseen foe, not knowing what to expect from over the course of the next few seconds or minutes, or am I going to make it through this or not? Mason writes about one of his friends who got badly wounded. And so I think it really speaks to that conviction and a reminder of the sacrifices that Vermonters made to preserve our democracy.
Tyler Alexander is the author of If I Can Get Home This Fall, a story of love, loss, and a cause in the Civil War. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us and telling us Dan Mason's story.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have to take one more quick break here. When we come back, we are going to hear about a very different kind of book full of brightly colored paintings of birds from around the globe. So bird watchers, you're going to want to stick around for this one. I'm Michaela Lafrac, and this is Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. When I say the words artist and birds, who do you think of? If any one name comes to mind, it's probably John James Audubon, the famed naturalist from the first half of the 19th century, who is known for his detailed illustrations of bird species. Well, John James, you have some serious competition now from the Montreal-based painter Robin Crofut-Brittingham. Her new book features hundreds of different bird species rendered in vivid detail and riotous color. It's called the Illuminated Book of Birds. In it, she also tells stories and shares fun facts about each species. She joins us now from Montreal. Robin, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here with us. And I got to say, a lot of books cross my desk, and this might be the most beautiful one. It is absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so much.
And since we're talking about birds today, I do have to ask, are you named after the bird, Robin?
A little bit. My mother tells me that actually as a little baby, like opening and closing my mouth, it reminded me of the way little baby robins open and close their mouths. So she said there's a bit of a link there.
No.
Yeah.
Well, you are joining us from Canada today, but you also have a lot of connections to the U.S. and Vermont in particular, right?
Yes. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and I went to the Putney School in Southern Vermont, which has been one of the biggest influences of my whole life, and still my dearest friends come from there. I was actually just in Vermont last weekend hiking Camel's Hump with some friends from the Putney School who live in Vermont. So I love it there.
And I am curious, I know you identify as a painter, you're an artist. Do you also identify as a birder?
Well, not really. I think that was part of my goal with this book, is that I think to be a birder is this sort of specific identity. And I have huge respect for birders who keep these lists and have all these species that they're trying to see and goals that they're trying to accomplish as really serious birders. And I got into birding through traveling, and it was really more just, oh, I've found myself in this place. I'd like to see these birds. And sort of trying to find a couple of the most significant or most gorgeous species of that particular place. So I really wanted to create a book that spoke not only to, serious birders, but also to was inviting to people who maybe just are getting into birding, and a way to kind of capture species from all over so that you could just flip through the book and be like, oh, maybe I want to see these birds, instead of a traditional bird guide, which it can be a bit intimidating if you aren't a more serious birder.
Right. So there are many, many birds in this book, around 400 actually, but that's still a small segment of the thousands of species that exist all around the world. How did you go about whittling it down to these couple hundred species?
Well, I mean, it was really hard, and I feel like I could do the whole book all over again and come up with, another hundreds of birds. So it's definitely a small selection in terms of the birds that are out there. But in my normal life, I am a visual artist, and my paintings are sort of these landscapes that are filled with all sorts of birds in a symbolic way. So I I started with birds that had an interesting story or an interesting symbolism, and then, birds that I was aesthetically drawn to. And then I really liked the idea of kind of, in my book, the pages are all have this arch shape. So my idea was you're sort of looking into a window of a particular place, and, these birds that are out your window. But I think also what's really a luxury about creating a bird book when you're an artist and not a scientist or not a birder is that I was able to really find birds that I just loved. And it was like, okay, this isn't necessarily the bird you're most likely to see. In fact, I've mentioned some birds that are extremely rare and any birder would be like amazed to have seen. But I wanted to include them because I found them just incredibly interesting or incredibly beautiful, or I found something about their symbolism within the culture that they're from to be really intriguing. So it's really a mix of the most common birds, but also just, birds that stood out to me.
Right. Well, some of my favorite pictures in this book are of those common birds, like pigeons, that really, through the way that you paint them and the colors you choose, oftentimes which are these kind of jewel tone blues and greens and reds, they bring these birds to life and make them seem really special in a way that I kind of forget to regard these species. And, I see a pigeon on the street and I look away immediately. But the way that you paint them, it looks a little bit magical. Was that one of your goals?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I wanted to, especially in the second section of the book, has sort of these groupings of birds. So there's pigeons and chickens and pheasants. And I really wanted to draw attention to some of those birds that we kind of just disregard because they're so common. And pigeons were one that I was really fascinated by because pigeons are actually incredibly, incredibly intelligent birds, and they have this incredible sense of navigation. And they also have this long historical relationship with humans and being trained to do things. And I think nowadays, they're often kind of dismissed or even disliked because they're these, flying rats of the city or whatever, but they're actually like magnificent birds. And they're very beautiful and very intelligent.
Yes, you have a couple different ones in here with, as many birds do. They have magnificent names, like the Nicobar pigeon, the Spinifex pigeon, the Luzon bleeding heart. And you also have a section on flightless birds, which I really loved. Could you tell us about some of those?
Oh, yeah. Well, the cassowary, which is one of the birds on the flightless birds page, was one that came to me through my research for my other work as a painter. Because my landscapes are often kind of depictions of this world of animals, and often I include a lot of extinct animals or rare animals. And I'm really interested in sort of nature as simultaneously seductive and beautiful and enchanting, but also that there's this real danger lurking underneath. And I think cassowaries are actually a really interesting example of that because like they look like this dinosaur, but they're incredibly beautiful, just this like beautiful, vibrant blue, but they're incredibly dangerous to people. And actually there's all these encounters of people sort of seeing them and trying to approach them and ending up being injured by them. So yeah, and ostriches also have some similar situations that are associated with them. But I was really interested in, just how diverse the behavior of birds is, and that you can have these birds that can't fly but are still part of this world.
Oh, some of the birds, as you mentioned, are extinct. What primary sources did you rely on to draw them?
Well, it was really hard to, unfortunately, there's just so many birds that are extinct. So it was really hard to choose which ones I wanted to include in that page. But again, I'm really interested in the stories about how humans relate to the natural world. And that's something that really motivates and animates my other work. And so the ways in which birds have gone extinct is really fascinating to me. I mean, and tragic. And so I have several books that talk about different species that have gone extinct. And then there's a painter called Walton Ford who often does these kind of Audubon-esque illustrations of painting of birds and animals that are threatened or vulnerable. And so I had discovered a lot through that, but narrowing it down to just a few, I really tried to choose the ones that had something about the manner in which they became extinct or the way that they related to humans that was particularly interesting to me.
Well, Robin, as we've said, there are pictures in this book of birds from all over the world and from different periods of history. There are also many birds that folks who are listening right now would recognize in their backyards. There's chickens, there's owls, there's sparrows. I'm wondering if you might be able to highlight a species that you included in this book that you love being able to see either out your window or in your part of Quebec.
Well, on the Birds of the Canadian Lakes page, I have a woodpecker, and actually I just saw a woodpecker this morning on my morning dog walk. So, and I have a 3-year-old son who's very fascinated by them. So, that's a bird that is relatively common, but I love. And then Canada to me has always been associated with loons, which are on that page as well. And I don't see them in my daily life here in Montreal, obviously, but in the summer times when I get out near lakes in Quebec, you often hear loons, and they're a bird that was important for me to include in the book, but also is coming up more and more in my other work because they have really interesting mythical associations in different indigenous cultures. And in Ojibwe mythology, they're sort of this messenger between worlds because, their behavior in reality is that they have this fascinating dive that they do under the water and then just sort of disappear and reemerge far, far away. So that in mythological terms was sort of translated into them being like messengers between two worlds. So that was a bird that was really important for me to include, both because I just find them so beautiful and ethereal. And obviously anyone who's heard a loon call, it's like unforgettable. Mm-hmm. But also because they have such a fascinating cultural and mythological significance.
The messenger between two worlds. That makes total sense with those red eyes that they have too. They're from another place.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so much of the bird mythology, when you read it, you're like, oh, of course. Owls are seen as these sort of like symbols of wisdom, or sometimes symbols of another world. And, you read this and you're like, oh, well, having seen an owl, that makes sense to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that there are enough other birds out there to fill a second book. Do you think you would ever make a second Illuminated Book of Birds, or are you going to put the subject to rest for a little bit?
I would love to. This is the first in a series of 3 books. I've just finished the second one, which is about flowers and plants. And the third one will be about animals. So it's really a chance for me to dive into this sort of natural history research that I had already been doing kind of in the shadows of my art practice in a way that's much more public. So, but maybe there'll be Birds Volume 2. We'll see.
Well, if you want to meet Robin, ask her more about her work, maybe get a book signed, she'll be hosting a launch event with Bear Pond Books and the North Branch Nature Center this Friday, November 7th in Montpelier. Robin Crofut-Brittingham's new book is called The Illuminated Book of Birds. It really is gorgeous. Robin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, as always, you can weigh in on our show, pitch us your own ideas, tell us about the book that you've just written by emailing vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. You can also find Vermont Public on Instagram. Today's show was directed by Jen Jarecki. John Ahrens is our managing producer. Andrea Lorian, Daniela Fierro, and Aaliyah Papes are our producers. Today's call screener was Daniela Fierro, and our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.